Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast series. Today I have Sarah with us. Um, Sarah's going to share her story, but first I'd like her to actually introduce herself. Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, where you've been, and I think you know the other line.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I just turned 28. I'm a student in the public health major at UNCG. I'm a bunny mom, so my bunny's my best friend. um, I currently work at a veterinary hospital. Um, Let's see. So originally, I'm from the Outer Banks, which is in North Carolina. I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina when I was 9, so that was 2002. Um, I've pretty much been in Wilmington since, but I've traveled around a little bit based on things that have happened and school and whatnot. Um, let's see. So I'm hoping to go into policy work related to public health, specifically with mental health policies and addiction, since that's what I'm passionate about. Trying to think if there's anything else. Um, I have both my parents are married. They've always been married, and I have a younger brother who's 2 years younger. Um,
Nice.
and currently, we're all back in one household.
Yeah, the pandemic will do that to you, right?
Yeah, well, my brother just got out of the military too, so
Gotcha.
he's in a transition period as well.
Yeah. And so, why is it that you're interested in the mental health and addiction side of things in public health?
Um, so I'm very passionate about reducing or breaking the stigma related to mental health disorders and addiction specifically. Since I have personally experienced addiction and mental health crises, as well as having family members who've gone through the same things and having a network of people in recovery who have come from sort of the same background with dealing with mental health and addiction. I realize there's still such a stigma surrounding getting help, speaking out about what's going on. Um, and there's just a lot of disparities where people are either there's a condescending attitude towards people, or I feel like, for example, anxiety and depression are pretty prevalent topics,
Hmm.
but I also feel like those words are kind of misused or overused.
Okay. Do you want to explain more about that?
Yeah, I feel like they're kind of just thrown around loosely, and someone might actually be experiencing depression or anxiety. So I don't want to say that they're not, but I think that they kind of get used jokingly or in a situation where it's not appropriate. Depression is more of a chronic long term condition. Um, if you're having a bad day, that's not necessarily depression. Um, but if you're actually experiencing depression, that term's appropriate. And so I don't want to say that that adds or takes away from the stigma, but I think it creates confusion for people to get help when they actually need it, on top of the stigma of being afraid to ask for help, for fear that you'll be looked down on, or this attitude that experiencing your emotions and crying, for example, is a sign of weakness. I think that's still somewhat a strong issue, and that's something that I experienced growing up, not because I was told that, crying or showing my emotions was weak, but it was just sort of like an internalized attitude I had, that made it very hard for me to appropriately regulate and handle my emotions. Um,
Yeah. Well, that's a lot to unpack there. Is
yeah,
so it seems like there's a lot of external pressure put on you that became internalized. Is that an
yeah,
appropriate thing to say?
I would say so. I would think societally we just still have a long way to go in terms of mental health and addiction. Whether it's policy or just viewpoints. Um, I mean, I think you can look in the media and see, somebody who's struggling mentally, and just see like how it's framed and what's said about them. And I mean, I'm not going to go too much more in depth because there's a lot there, but I
I
mean, you
mean,
could
we
even,
got plenty of time if you want to go in depth. We're trying to tell real stories, so
yeah.
you can talk about whatever you want.
I think you could even look at it in terms of gender, for example. I think there's still such a gender stereotype when it comes to thoughts and, you know, um, just your mental health. I think, like, headlines, for example, for a male who's experiencing some sort of issue that's mentally based, is very different than someone who's female. Um, for example, if you look at like Demi Lovato, who has come out and publicly talked about her addiction issues and her overdose not that long ago, and just like the headlines around that versus, someone else, Tiger Woods and his sexual addiction. I think
Mm.
you could compare those and see that there's very stark differences in how those were handled and what comments were. So there's just a lot of work to do.
Hmm.
There's also mental health is nowhere near talked about or, um, you know, worked on enough compared to physical health. And you can't have good health if you don't have good mental health as well. Um, so that's why I'm interested in going into it, because there's just so much work to do. And just to get it to the point where we're looking at things from a prevention standpoint and
Hmm.
not just waiting until there's a crisis and then now you've got to figure out how to work with this person who could have gotten help a very long time ago, and the situation would be potentially a lot less complex than it would be at that point. I mentioned when you had your mom on the other podcast, I feel like addiction, especially, it makes it so hard to like timeline events. Like I remember doing like intake forms at different, like mental health or like when I entered treatment for substance use, and they would ask you to like timeline your life and like your substance use and different things you had gone through, and it's so difficult, to try and like put that in like a neat little timeline. So I'll try and not like be all over the place, but I can't guarantee that.
No, you don't have to guarantee it because um, for those of you listening that have checked out the first episode of the podcast series, um, it's definitely what Sarah's referring to is have my mom on there, and we were trying to recall the events of the last 3 to 5 years, and it was a nightmare. We couldn't figure out what happened when, the approximate times and the approximate dates, and it was just so difficult to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So don't worry about it, Sarah. You and I are in the same boat with where we just can't figure it out. So if you need to you know, jump around, jump up and get down. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Um, so yeah, like I said, I was born in Elizabeth City, and I lived in Kitty Hawk in the Outer Banks for the first 9 years of my life. And like I said, my brother's 2 years younger. So growing up, my parents have always been like very hardworking, conservative people. There's family history of both mental health issues and addiction going back like as far as I know, on both sides of my family. Um, Growing up, so my dad's in law enforcement, my mom's a pharmacist. Um, I remember growing up, they worked very different schedules, and I feel like for maybe the first 5 or 6 years of my life, like I'm not going to say they were always at work because they weren't. But I feel like they worked a lot, and as a result, we had babysitters that they did background checks and stuff on. It wasn't random people, but we had babysitters. My older cousin, lived with us at one point for several years.
Mhm.
Um, so my parents worked a lot. My dad being in law enforcement, and he was actually like on the SWAT team for Kitty Hawk and Nag's Head. They He had like a chaotic schedule. Um, so I don't know if like that's where feelings of like abandonment and rejection came in, or if that was just something maybe more biologically based. But I know growing up, I kind of felt like a loner. I could be hanging out in a group of people, like all close friends or family, and feel invisible, even though they could be talking to me.
Mhm.
I know like getting into like middle school, I would be at a friend's house with everyone hanging out, and I would just leave and walk home, and they'd call me and be like, where'd you go?" And I'm like, "Oh, I just left. I wanted to go home." But I would
Mhm.
just leave and not say anything because I felt invisible.
Mhm.
Um Growing up, I didn't know I knew about like depression and alcoholism, but I didn't know like that's what I was experiencing until later on. Um, so I remember I was like a very quiet, shy kid, unless I was with people who I felt really close to, and then could be very outgoing and social. Um,
Mhm.
I mean that's as far back as I can remember being like that. I always had like a few close friends. I never was like the life of the school or whatever.
Mhm.
I played soccer growing up since I was like maybe 7. So soccer and reading and schoolwork were like my escapes. Those were like my coping mechanisms.
Mhm.
Um, Growing up, I knew that my dad's mom struggled with depression.
Mhm.
I knew that some family members of his had issues with drugs.
Mhm.
Um, I knew that my great grandmother on my dad's side, so paternal side, had committed suicide, and my aunt, when I was very young, also committed suicide.
Mhm.
Um, I didn't know my great grandmother, but I knew my aunt, at least for like the first chunk of my life. When I was, this is where it gets difficult. So I think when my aunt committed suicide, I was maybe 6, and I lost both of my grandfathers on my mom's dad and my dad's dad within the same year when I was between 5 and 7. So I lost like all three of those people around the same time. Now, when my aunt committed suicide, my I was young, so my parents at the time like didn't tell us she committed suicide. For some reason, looking back, I thought it was cancer.
Mhm.
Um,
Well,
and that's
so
mhm,
think no, sorry to interrupt you, but if we think about all this loss all at once around the time that you are, in your formative years,
yeah,
it's,
it's
you know, it's a lot. It's a lot, and people deal with loss in different ways, but I think this is setting us up for where you're about to go with the rest of your story.
Yeah, so um let me think. Hold on, I'm going to step outside for a second. Um my I didn't really get to know my grandfathers or my aunt that well. I mean, I obviously have memories, but I wasn't close to them. So I would say at the time, like I couldn't point to that and like it wasn't like this great loss. But yes, looking back, like that was a lot of loss at one time, especially for a young child who doesn't understand death, and especially with like my aunt committing suicide, I wasn't told the actual reason. Um so it's just very like confusing, and did have an impact even though I might not have known it at the time.
Hmm.
Also, I'm trying to think. Yeah, so growing up, I knew that there was issues with some of my dad's siblings, other than the
Hmm.
one who committed suicide, um, doing drugs. Like I knew that my uncle had lost his license and gotten in trouble several times. Um, I knew I learned growing up that my mom's mom had trouble with alcohol. Um, but she was adopted, so like there wasn't really any information about her actual genes
Hmm.
in terms of addiction. And when I was 5, my we lived in the Outer Banks, and you basically had to drive to Virginia to do anything. There wasn't much in the Outer Banks at that point besides the beach. So my dad was working. My mom had taken us up to Chuck E. Cheese in Virginia for the day. And I had started like entering dare, or like at least learning about alcohol and drugs at that point.
Hmm.
So I knew that drinking and driving was bad. um my mom drank while we were at Chuck E. Cheese, and then I guess had gotten some more from the store and was drinking and driving on the way back to Kitty Hawk from Virginia. And I remember I was 5. I remember seeing her doing that and saying something, along the lines of like, "Mom, you can't be drinking and driving."
Hmm.
And I remember like soon thereafter saying that there was blue lights, and so my mom ended up getting a DUI, or it might have been a DWI back then,
Hmm.
with us in the car when I was 5. So my brother would have been 3. Um,
Hmm.
and I remember like my dad had been working and he had to come to Virginia, and so for like a year or some change after that, my mom couldn't drive. I remember like we taxied a lot, when we had to go somewhere if my dad was working.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember like being so angry I wouldn't like kiss her or talk to her for like that night, when we got back. So I mean, even at that young age, like,
Those are totally normal feelings to feel. Like
yeah,
your mother just kind of, I don't want to say threw away, but
yeah. I mean, she
she,
messed up.
she messed up big time. And you're
Yeah,
what, 5 or 6 years old?
yeah. And I'm just starting to learn about like morality and like right and wrong and safety and all these.
Consequences and that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Yeah.
Um. And so yeah, I mean, even looking back then, like the fact that I wouldn't kiss her, hug her, talk to her when she was like crying and apologizing, I can see that there was a struggle with like emotions even then. Which
Hmm.
I'm not saying like a 5-year-old should be able to like effectively handle that and have a conversation, but
Hmm.
even back then, like things were so internalized. Like I think I started forming resentments very early on, even if I didn't understand like that's what it was.
Hmm.
So I guess just all of these like different events just like kept compounding. And again, like I was never explicitly told like you have to be perfect, you have to get straight A's and be like this perfect human. but somewhere along the way, like, I
Mhm.
picked up on that and learned that. And again, that could be like a combination of genetics or whatever. Um, but I was always like a very like I had to things had to be perfect. I had to do perfectly in school. I had to be like the perfect soccer player. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. I really don't. Because I remember my parents always telling me, as long as you do your best.
Mhm.
Like that was always the motto. Like as long as you do your best for, even until I got out of high school, like it was always like, or even when I first entered college, school is your job. So that's
Mhm.
what I was told. So it was never like you have to do perfectly.
What was their
That
best?
work hard, be honest. I would say like kind of conservative values. Be a good person basically.
Mhm.
um, so yeah, I just somewhere I picked up on that. And so on top of like not being able to deal or handle emotions effectively, I just had like these unrealistic standards of like attaining perfection or um you know I wouldn't say that I wanted everyone to be my friend, but I was like I get easily attached. So even in just like friendships, I would
Mm.
have like high standards, because I'm like committing and putting all this work in, and I would say that I'm a pretty good friend. So I would get easily offended if I felt like something messed that up. Um,
Can you describe what that's like?
yeah, frustrating. I mean,
Mhm.
I've obviously grown and like come to learn. um,
Go.
yeah, so growing up in the Outer Banks, I didn't small town, not much to do. I had like one good best friend, and then I had a couple of like friends from school that I wouldn't say were best friends. And then there was a kid down the street that my brother and I hung out with, and my best friend hung out with. Um, but that was like basically it until I moved. So growing up, my friend Samantha, he was very like a tomboy, I guess. And I remember when I was younger, she used to tell me like I was like too city or whatever, like afraid to get my hands dirty, which I don't remember that. I remember like constantly being in the dirt or doing something outside. But like that was the only friend I really had. So when I moved, that was a loss within itself. Um,
Mhm.
it was a loss for her. And then when I moved, I had a friend next door the same age that worked out perfectly. She had an older sister that we hung out with, and then a few years later, another girl, well, they were a year younger, but I'll just say our age, moved in, and she had two sisters, a younger one and an older one. Um, and then, at that point, I was more into soccer. Like I was on more competitive teams, so I was around more people. Um, I really picked into soccer, and I was doing soccer year round at that
Mhm.
point. But yeah, growing up, like when my friends in Wilmington would go hang out with other people or like do something where like, I wasn't invited or whatever, I remember just like being so, I guess, butthurt about it.
Mhm.
Because like those were my people. And like if I didn't
Mhm.
have those people, like who did I have? Um, I also didn't like get into dating or really like pay attention to guys until later on. So like when my friends like started hanging out with guys and dating and experimenting with sneaking beer from their parents' house, I wasn't into that. Um, I guess part of the perfection was I was also like very detail oriented, huge rule follower. Um, I wouldn't say, I mean, I probably did, I guess. I judged people who didn't follow the rules or follow the law.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, that comes from probably being the child of a law enforcement officer.
yeah, definitely. So for a long time, like getting into middle school and high school, I was so focused on school and soccer.
Hmm.
I wasn't like hanging out with those people who were drinking at their parents' house or starting to smoke weed or whatever have you. I wasn't dating, I wasn't cheating in school, and so I think that put like a huge barrier up between me and like actually socializing and making friends. Because I was so focused on like being perfect and following the rules and being like, you know,
Being a
teacher's pet, I
nerd,
guess. Yeah, being a nerd.
a big fat
And
nerd.
exactly. And all these people are like, starting to experiment with drinking and guys and
Well, look at where you are
all that.
now.
Well,
28 years old and in college, and you're a nerd.
I am a nerd. Um, I also so like getting middle school, I remember um again a little more outgoing, but still like pretty quiet. I know people even commented like in school one time, like when I started to become more social, they were like,
Hmm.
"Oh my god, you talk!" like,
That
uh,
cannot be a good feeling, honestly.
no, it was like I don't know. They always just saw me as like teacher's pet, quiet, like doesn't say much. But I guess on the inside, I like wanted friends and wanted not to be popular, but to be well liked and like, I started to get into like wanting guys to notice me and to go on dates and
Hmm.
anyway, so yeah, getting into middle school and high school, I remember dealing with like anger. I was
Hmm.
very angry. Now my dad also he's a very good driver and he learned defensive driving, obviously. But he had major anger issues and road rage, like never abusive. Um, but he and I are a lot alike. Like it, I mean, it's changed, but growing up, he didn't cry. Like to see him cry was really weird. Um,
Hmm.
he didn't like talk about how he felt. Um, even when like he lost his dad or his sister, like I don't remember him talking about it or crying about it. He
Hmm.
was very like almost had a wall up, very stoic. And my mom and my brother are a lot alike in the sense like they're more sensitive, well, outwardly sensitive. Um, they're not, they'll cry in front of people. Um, so he was angry, and I don't know like if that fed off or if it was just like the fact that I was struggling mentally but like didn't know it. Um, I also like dealt with anger and
Hmm. Well, you said at the beginning that you kind of maybe the environment, maybe genetics or what have you from your you don't cry, but it seems like your father was a role model in that aspect.
yeah, I would say so. So things just like built up. I kept everything inside. I used soccer in school as an escape. I would read, I read the last Harry Potter book in 2 days, and that was school days. Like those were my go-tos. And then getting into high school, well, and my friends, and getting into high school, my friends had started branching out. They hung out with a lot of other people. They were doing some stuff that I didn't agree with. So I kind of lost my friends there.
Hmm.
Um, School, I noticed like people are cheating, they're drinking on the weekends, like so school wasn't the same either. And then soccer, I got injured my sophomore year, and I tore a ligament between my shin bones and uh, fractured a ankle bone. And So I couldn't play soccer. I couldn't walk for 4 months, and so I couldn't play soccer. So I lost soccer, and
So you lost your friends,
lost my friends.
and then you lost one of your biggest outlets.
Yes, and then my
Hmm.
sophomore year, my both my grandmothers started entering into really bad health,
Hmm.
and so my parents, my dad at the time, like he stopped working and was stay at home when we moved in 2002 up until like in my later years in high school. Um, so he was constantly traveling to be with his mom. My mom was working, and then she would get off work and then go be with her mom. So my parents were gone a lot. I couldn't drive at this point, and my brother was obviously younger, so he didn't have a license. So my sophomore year, like I didn't really do much. Um, and I think that really added to like the feelings of depression and anxiety and anger, um, which at the time didn't know that's what they were. So then, my junior year of high school, I kind of just gave up. Like, I just became apathetic because I was just so angry about life. Like, I started to like struggle with religion. Um, was just really irritated by like hypocrisy in Christianity,
So did
and
you grow up?
I
Sorry
grew.
for interrupting, but you grew
Yeah,
up in the Christian
yeah.
church.
I forgot to say that. We were very active in the Episcopal Church. I was an acolyte. We did like youth trips, uh, different stuff like that. So I started struggling with religion. I noticed like there's just a lot of problems in the world. There's a lot of violence. People are suffering. So I became like cynical. um, and that didn't help. And then on top of that, I have like these family issues with my grandmothers. I could start to play soccer again, but it wasn't the same. Like the high school team, I didn't like the girls. So club was like the only time I was happy playing soccer. Um, and sorry, I'm trying to think. So junior year, I kind of became apathetic, and I was like, well, if these people are cheating in school and like getting good grades, and they are dating, and like, you know, basically everything looks so good on the outside for them. I was like, I might as well just join them because I can't beat them. So the end of junior year is when I like started dressing differently. I started like hanging out with new people. The end like New Year's, I guess going into senior year, I like smoked weed for the first time. Um, and from there, like things just really changed. I was still a good student, but I wasn't like trying as hard. I didn't care as much. I was still not expressing emotions, but I now like had a new way to cope with them.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, I mean that's kind of where the story really starts.
Thank you for joining us for episode 1 of Sarah's story. She says that the story is just beginning, so we'll have to find out in episode 2. We'll see you soon.